Our gospel reading today is from Mark chapter 8, and we begin with verse 31. Jesus then began to teach his disciples that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Jesus spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then Jesus called the crowd to him, along with his disciples, and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." Word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God. So a popular meme says, courage is knowing it might hurt and doing it anyway. Stupidity's the same thing, and that's why life is hard. Courage is knowing that it might hurt and doing it anyway. Stupidity is the same, and that is why life is hard. Of course, generally, we tend to avoid things that hurt. That's the way we're made. We'd like life to be more comfortable. We would like to get our troubles fixed and make life easier. But Jesus today speaks of denying ourselves, of taking up the cross and following him. We'd say, Jesus, we would just as soon continue on the way we currently live, just maybe a little happier or a little richer. But Jesus says, take up your cross. And evidently it has something to do with denying the self, following Jesus, and giving away something of our life so that we are not clutching it and hoarding it. And all for the sake of Jesus and the gospel. Take up your cross, Jesus says. So we first need to understand what Jesus does not mean by that, what Jesus does not mean by take up your cross. Sometimes life is not easy. There is a burden of nature or a burden of circumstances, something unpleasant, something that is difficult, and we'll say, well, that's my cross to bear. That's not what Jesus is talking about. Johanna was born blind. That is her cross to bear. Or Jay lost his job because the business closed due to COVID. And he's too close to retirement age to get hired by anybody else. I guess that's his cross to bear. No, that is not what Jesus is talking about. Many people, including people sitting in this room right now and those watching online, have suffered greatly during the winter ice storm, maybe still suffering from lack of water and power. People suffered in the last hurricane. People suffer in times of drought. Or a man's arthritis is acting up, or his knee is bothering him. Or a single mom is living in a cycle of poverty and just can't get out. And sometimes people will say, well, that's their cross to bear. No, it is not. That is not what Jesus is talking about. The cross that Jesus speaks of does not refer to our individual burdens. It does not refer to our headaches, our toothaches, our bad jobs, the dysfunction of in-laws or family or friends. It has nothing to do with hurt feelings or illness or grief due to loss. Those are called heavy burdens, or what St. Paul calls a thorn in the flesh. Some kind of heavy burden that is maybe tragic or at least difficult and makes life hard for us. Those are burdens, and burdens call for our love and care and mercy and assistance. It has been so neat to see people assisting and helping one another in a time of difficulty. But those things are not what Jesus is talking about when he says to take up the cross. The cross that Jesus journeys toward is his own death as a result. Hear those words. As a result of Jesus living God's kingdom in this world. The cross comes as a result of living God's kingdom in this world. When Jesus brings justice and love into an unjust and a hateful world, the world is going to come after him. I guarantee it. I guarantee it. There will be a confrontation between God's ways and the ways of the human race. That is guaranteed. Jesus is not saying here that he has a mission to suffer and die, that God's plan and God's purpose for him is to suffer and die, that Jesus is just kind of some puppet in God's sadistic plan. No. The mission of Jesus and the purpose of God is to give life to this world, to heal the world, to welcome and reconcile the sinner, to undo evil wherever he sees it, and to save what is lost and dying in all the ways that we can be lost and dying. That's the purpose of Jesus, to bring life and reconciliation and salvation. But you see, his enemies cannot see that. There's a kind of blindness, something that is covering their eyes. They cannot see that this is God breaking into the world with hope and with healing. They can't see it. All they see is that Jesus is causing them a lot of trouble and a lot of headache. They see Jesus causing chaos to their way of life, which, if it isn't comfortable, at least it's pretty good. At least it's controllable. They can control their lives. So, therefore, both the temple and the Capitol will oppose Jesus. The religious and the political, they will oppose Jesus. He is not following their order of things and the compromises they have made so life could be pretty good. So it will be the cross for Jesus. His purpose is to bring life, but it will end up that life will get him the cross, and it will end up that the cross is the way that Jesus brings life. Understand that Jesus has a choice. That's important. Jesus has a choice. He's not, as I said, he's not simply God's puppet on strings. Jesus agonizes between his will and the will of his Father in heaven. And this happens at the beginning of his ministry that we read last week. As soon as he begins his ministry, Satan takes him out into the wilderness, the adversary, to tempt him, to test him. And it happens again today in the middle of his ministry. In fact, this passage is literally in the middle of the Gospel of Mark. And the disciples have just begun to realize that, yes, he's the Messiah. Isn't this great? He does miracles. He does healings. Look at all this power. He's the Messiah. And the Satan, the adversary, enters into Peter, or uses Peter's mouth and voice. And Peter tries to tempt Jesus away from this path that is going to lead to the cross. That can't be the way any Messiah would walk. And Peter tries to tempt him away. And then the third temptation will be again later in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus will have the freedom to choose the cross or not. Or not. It was not conscription, but choice. Beth Marie Halverson, a pastor, writes this. It was not conscription, but choice that compelled Jesus to deny himself and give up his life so people know God's love for all. Jesus shows us there is no place where God will not go. The manger, the table with supper for sinners, the cross on Calvary. There is no place that God will not go, no matter what the world throws at God. So essentially that means there are two things. There are two things about the cross of Jesus. Number one, the cross was taken up willingly and willfully. Jesus made the choice to bring life and to live for God, to live God's kingdom in this world, even though it would mean rejection and suffering and dying. It was taken up willingly. Secondly, Jesus took up the cross as a sacrifice for others. Not for pity, not for praise, not to get his name remembered, because sometimes if you are cruelly assassinated or killed, you will become a hero. And not to start a new religion to name after himself. Jesus went to the cross for others, for us. Jesus would not dial down his ministry to spare his own life or to avoid any suffering. His commitment to the healing of you and me and humanity, his commitment knows no limits. Neither does the life-giving power of God. It is limitless. And it is all for you, for me, for us. Dietrich Bonhoeffer called Jesus the man for others. A transformation of all human life is given in the fact that, to quote Bonhoeffer, Jesus is there only for others. So the cross of Jesus is chosen willingly, and it is a sacrifice on behalf of others, not the self. Which really is what it means for us also when Jesus says, take up your cross. Take up your cross. It's what we choose and take willingly. It's what we choose and take willingly and willfully for Jesus' sake. And it is a sacrificial devotion to other people and for other people. A cross is not a flood or a storm. It's not illness or death because we don't choose those things. A cross is the life we choose to live. A cross is the suffering we're willing to take up for Jesus in order to help others, even as Jesus himself went to Calvary on behalf of the world. What an amazing and wonderful thing it has been these last couple of weeks to see people helping one another, giving up a little bit of their own comfort and going and helping one another during a time of storm. The storm's not a cross. It was a heavy burden. But people going and helping one another That's taking up the cross. We can think of famous people, perhaps throughout the centuries. St. Francis of Assisi, in the 1200s, he renounced the wealth of his family. It was great wealth. He could have been a very wealthy man. He gave up a wild and free lifestyle because we're told he was very handsome and very charming. He founded a religious order. He embraced poverty, and he worked the rest of his life on behalf of the poor. Or Albert Schweitzer, who gave up a career as a scholar and a musician, the early 1900s. He went to provide medical care and to kind of heal effects of colonization in a little unknown part of Africa. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke against segregation and racism when he could have just been quiet and lived into retirement with a nice church pension. But they made a choice. They took up a cross. These, of course, are giants of faith, and we think, oh gosh, we can't do all of that. But we can do something. And so the question does come to you, will you take up your cross? Not everyone has to answer that. Only Christians. Only Christians have to answer the question, will you take up your cross? And only the Spirit can give us the power to say yes. When everything in us wants to say no, the Spirit can give us the power to say yes. To a world that says people are worthy only because of their income or their social status or a particular color of skin, Christians say every life is precious in the sight of Jesus. And to a world that says revenge is always the answer to wrongdoing, we say love and forgiveness shall overcome evil. Yes, it shall. And to a world that ignores people who are in need, people who are hurting, or people who are hungry, we say as Christians, we will help. To those who are hurting and broken, to those who are at the end of their rope, or maybe at the end of their self, whether that self is self-ego buildup or whether it's self-abasement. When they're at the end of the self, we lift high the cross of Jesus. We lift high the cross of Jesus for healing, release, forgiveness, mercy, love, grace. In other words, for life to begin again. Amen.